This tape will be about World War II and the experiences, some of the experiences that I had when I served in the Navy during that war. First, I go back to the previous tape where I mentioned that there was a war going on in Europe. The Germans under Hitler had taken over a good share of Europe. The Russians under Stalin had taken several countries, and Mussolini in Italy had joined the Axis powers, which was with Germany. The Great Britain islands were not invaded as yet, but there was a very good chance that they would be attacked soon. And the United States was trying to supply England with ships and materials and so forth, but was trying diligently to stay out of the war. The Japanese, in the meantime, were doing some negotiations in Washington, D.C. with some of our officials, and actually what they were doing was just biding some time and kind of spoofing us a little bit while they got their Navy ready to attack us. So in 1941, on December 7th, the Japs bombed Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Fortunately, they didn't have troops and so forth along to invade the island, or they could have done it very easily. They probably could have even invaded California at the time if they had been so prepared. But they did enough devastation at Pearl Harbor to involve us in the war. They sunk all of our battleships or damaged them. Several cruisers, destroyers, and other ships blew up munitions dumps, and many buildings. Thousands of sailors and soldiers were killed and injured. It was a bad day. Roosevelt was our president at the time, and late in the afternoon, after meeting with Congress, he declared war on Japan. We were ill prepared for this war, and didn't have much of a Navy, and what they did have, they sunk the best part of it in the Pacific. And the sailors and soldiers at that time were, of course, well trained, but there weren't enough of them. And the Japanese invaded the islands in the Pacific where we had men stationed, and either killed or captured all of them. They invaded the Philippines and did the same thing there. So at that time, there was a lot of us young fellas got pretty excited about getting into the service. We knew we would eventually be drafted, but some of us were going to volunteer, and I can remember Jim London and I talked about it, and we thought we better hurry and get in there and before it was all over. Little did we know it was going to last for many years. Jim and Lund and a fellow by the name of Bob Palmer, Scott Kramer, and Don Gavin, they were all friends and students in the same grade that I was in and graduated with. We all got together and decided to take a test for the Air Force. So we did that, and it was a long test, and many subjects. In fact, I think it was 5 different subjects that it was based on. Well, I was a little overwhelmed, so I didn't get too far in it. Don Gavin did it quite a bit, and then he dropped out. But Jim Lund finished, and Bob Palmer finished, and Scott finished, and Palmer got the highest mark that anybody had received up to that time. Now, Jim flunked out because he was only like 5 points short. And if he had just made a mark by the questions that he didn't answer, but if he'd made a mark to show you he had read the questions, he would have got credit for the other 5 points and would have been accepted. I believe Scott Kramer was accepted too. So anyhow, Jim and I wondered just what to do at that time. We waited a little while and then decided we should go to the Navy. Well, I had to get some type of written permission from my mother, and I can't remember if it was because I was only 19 or it was because she was disabled. Anyhow, she agreed to sign for me, and Jim and I went down to the post office and signed up, and ended up a few days later over in Minneapolis. I took some more physicals and so forth, and we're going to be shipped to the Great Lakes in Wisconsin. We got to the Great Lakes late in the evening, and they put us up in some cots, if I remember correctly, and then of course the next day we went through the indoctrination, and unless you've been in the service, you have no idea as to what it involves. They strip you down, of course, to your bare skin, and you turn over everything that you have, either to the Salvation Army or you arrange to send it back home. And then they give you some more physicals, and you're walking around in nude all this time, and this of course is something that most fellas weren't too used to, so it was kind of embarrassing to start out with. But it was all part of the system to break you down so that you could eventually blend in with the rest of the Navy. They issued us our uniforms and our sea bags and our hammocks, and sent us off to a barracks, which in our case was a couple of miles away, and we became a company. If I remember right, there were about 125 or 150 in a company. It was a 2-story building. Early on, the chief that was in charge of our company lined us all up, and then he asked, are there any fellas here that have had any military service at all, say in some type of school or whatever? And of course, a couple guys stepped forward right away. So they had gone to military school in high school. And immediately they were put in charge. And then he asked if there was anybody that had worked for the post office or that had any experience with the mail service. Well, there's where I made my first mistake. I had been what they call a mail clerk at C.B. Lyon Company, and there I had sorted the mail and put the stamps on the envelopes and licked the envelopes and separated the ones that went out of town and the ones that went to Minneapolis and the ones that went to St. Paul. And so I was kind of a big shot. I was a mail clerk. So I stepped forward. I was the only one. And he said, "What's your name?" And I told him, and he said, "Okay, you're the new mailman." Well, I didn't know what that involved, but I found out real soon. It was, of course, several days, maybe a week or two before we started to get any mail. In the meantime, we did a lot of marching and drilling and exercising and training of all kinds. And then when we were notified that there was a mailbag for us, that happened to be way up by where we had come in and been mustered in a couple of miles away. So he says, Chief said, "Smith, you go up and get the mail." Well, I didn't even know where the post office was, but I found it, and it was a small bag of mail for our company, and so I brought it back, and then it was my job to read all the names and pass out the mail, and it was pretty exciting. The mail call, of course, was always exciting when you're in the service. Well, the days went by, and there was more mail every day, and the bag got bigger and bigger, and there was packages, and people were getting cookies and all kinds of goodies, and then pretty soon the bag was really big and heavy to carry. I couldn't hardly carry it. And it was almost 2 miles. Maybe it was a mile and a half, but it was close to 2 miles. And then pretty soon, after a few more days or a week, then there were 2 bags, and pretty soon there was 3 bags. Well, there was no way I could carry more than one. So what I'd do is take one bag and I'd carry it down about a half a mile. I'd go back, get another bag, carry that down about a half a mile, and then another bag, and then continue on that way. But finally, my back was just about killing me, and I just couldn't handle all that. So I told the chief that, it was going to take me all day to go get the mail. Of course, now I didn't have to march with the rest of the company, but this was worse than marching with the company. I would much rather have been marching. But once you volunteer for something, you don't back out, and you should learn early on. You never volunteer. You should never volunteer for anything in the service, because you're going to come up on the wrong side. Finally, he assigned a fella to help me. He was a great big guy from Kentucky, if I remember right. Couldn't hardly read or write, but he was strong. So he could carry 2 of these bags at a time over his shoulder, and of course I could only handle one, and then most of the time I dragged that. But he'd help me then the rest of the time while we were in that company. It seemed to me that was 6 weeks that we were in the Great Lakes. Towards the end, though, I got sick. A lot of fellows used to get sick from the shots. Getting those shots was something else. You had to have them, of course, and a lot of us had never really had any shots to speak of, but we got shots for everything that they could dream up. And sometimes when you'd go to get your shots, they'd have you take your shirt off, and there'd be a medical sailor, one on each side, and they'd give you a shot in both arms. And then you were really in tough shape. And at that time, of course, we were sleeping in hammocks. And that, of course, I could almost write a book on the hammocks, how bad it was trying to sleep in a hammock. But again, this was all part of our training. And some fellows, I fell out on hammocks several times, and different fellows fell out. And it was about a 4-foot drop, and one guy broke his arm. But anyhow, we used to really suffer trying to get in those hammocks with our arms full of shots. But yeah, we made it. And of course, carrying the mail bags with those shots in my arm didn't help much either. Anyhow, we got through all that, But the last few days I got sick. It was kind of called cat fever. It was like a cold or something, and you had a high fever and so forth. So they sent me to the hospital along with a few other guys. And then I was very disappointed because, for two reasons. One is that then you didn't get to go to OGU, which was outgoing unit, and that was another barracks, and you'd go there and then you'd wait till you were assigned to where you were going to go, to school or a ship or a base or wherever you were going to go. And of course I was separated now from my company. In addition to that, my sister had bought my car from me, and at that time I had a 34 Chev, and she drove down to the Great Lakes to see me for her last time, because she was then going to drive to California to live. Well, somehow or other they got me out of the hospital and I got to meet my sister for an hour or so. But then after a few days they let me out, and I did get to the OG unit with a part of my company. In fact, Jim Lund was still there, and so a bunch of us took different kinds of tests. And one of the tests that they had to do with listening to code, and that happened to be, even though I couldn't hear very good, but I guess they just took whoever they thought might pass, and they assigned me then to a radio school. But Jim had mechanical training, and so he was assigned to aviation machinist school. His school was going to be at Navy Pier in Chicago, and I was going to be at the University of Chicago. So we were going to be in the same town together anyhow. But he got a leave of, it was 28 days, that's how they gave us a break at that time, to go home. So, but I didn't get one. I was just sitting there, and he said, well, don't worry, you'll be coming home. And I don't know till this day what he knew, but he apparently knew something. So about 2 days later, I got notice that I got a 28-day leave and could go home. Well, of course, you didn't call on a telephone or anything in those days, and you just went. So I got on the train, went to St. Paul, got off the train. Now I have all my gear I'm carrying. And I thought, well, I'll catch a streetcar, and it was about a mile and a half or two, whatever, to my house, or where my folks, my grandmother lived. And as I was walking down the street to catch the streetcar, here I see my dad's car with Jim Lund driving it, and my mother's in the car. And they turned around and came up alongside of me, and they said, you want to ride? Well, I just was dumbfounded. Somehow, and I have no way of knowing, he never told me, he knew I was coming home, and he even knew what train it was on. And he picked me up, and of course I was so glad to see my mother. And, excuse me, he took me home to my house. Well, we of course had a good time the next 4 weeks. He went back to school before I did, and then I went on to the University of Chicago. At the University of Chicago, we stayed in a place called Judson Burton Court. It was a building where university students had stayed, a dormitory type thing, and it was a beautiful building. And the rooms each had like 2 cots in them, and a desk and a couple of chairs. And then there was a big mess hall, a big dining room to eat in, and so that's where we were to stay while we went to the radio school. Well, we would train there also, do a lot of marching and exercising and so forth, and then we'd go to school every day and learn, those that didn't learn no typing would learn typing, and we'd practice, and then we'd start practicing the code. Well, we were there, if I remember correctly, for 4 months, but I'm not sure that that was exactly right. I'm going to take a little break here at this time and use my magnifying glass to look up some of these dates. I need the glass because I'm visually impaired, and I'll go into more detail of that and that at a later time. I had joined the Navy on April 21st, 1942, and then, as I stated, went on to the Great Lakes, and then from the Great Lakes went to Chicago. I was at the Great Lakes until July 2nd, 1942, and then I was in Chicago from that time till November 30th of 1942, at which time we went to Norfolk and went aboard the USS Augusta. Our starting salary was $21 a month, and of that they withheld $6 a month for your life insurance. And when I got into the University of Chicago, there was an additional $2 a month held out for your laundry. So we didn't have a lot of money to spend, but I was fortunate in that Chicago was fairly close to home, so I could take the train when I had a 72-hour leave, and I would go to St. Paul, probably once every 3 weeks. The train fare was $10 round trip for servicemen. So you can see I used up more than my income and some of my savings in order to go home. But of course that was real important because that was where my best gal was, and Charlotte and I were still going together, and spent those times together when I could come home. Jim and I, of course, got together now and again in Chicago. We didn't always have liberty at the same time, but now and again we were able to get together. The people in Chicago were very, very good to the servicemen. They had a building downtown, a Chicago servicemen's building or something of that nature. And if you would go there and look on the bulletin board, there would always be parties to go to. Now in this building, of course, there were several floors, and there was pool tables and ping pong tables, and there was lounges and libraries and all sorts of things. But most of the fellows would check on these parties and sign up for them. And what would happen is that the people that were going to have the parties, they called them block parties. They'd be a group of neighbors would get together, and they would come down in their cars and pick you up and take you out to where the party was going to be. Most of the time they would do that. Sometimes you had to get your own transportation, take the elevated or whatever to get wherever it was. And then they would have plenty to eat and drink, and there would be dancing, and we just had a good time. The people were just so good to us. And then usually after the party was over, someone would take you in their car and take you back to your place where you were staying. So we had a pretty good time in Chicago. When we finished school, took our tests, passed, we were given a third-class radioman rating. Now that was really about equivalent to a sergeant in the Army. And of course it meant a lot more money. I don't remember how much, but I think we got $47 a month after that. And then we were put on a train and went to Norfolk, Virginia. Some of us were assigned to the USS Augusta, which was a heavy cruiser. Seems to me there was about 6 or 7 of us radiomen that went aboard the Augusta. That was quite an experience. I had never been very far away from home before, and here we were on the East Coast, going aboard a ship very late at night. It was very dark, couldn't see much of the ship, but they took us down below decks to the mess hall, and there we were supposed to string up our hammocks and turn in. So we did that. Well, then the next morning, took our hammocks down, of course, so they could put up the tables to eat, and we ate, and now I went topside. Well, what an experience that was. Couldn't hardly believe it. Looked around, here were all these ships, battleships and cruisers and destroyers. I didn't even know what most of them were. It was just amazing. So I hurried back down to my gear and got out my writing tablet and so forth. And of course, at this point, we hadn't been indoctrinated too much and hadn't been told much, but I was excited. So I had to write to Charlotte, and I had been writing to her just about every day prior to that, and she wrote to me almost every day. So I sat down and explained to her how we came aboard ship and how I went topside the next day and saw all these battleships and 7 destroyers and 6 carriers, and I was just going on and on. I was just overwhelmed, and wrote 3-4 pages. Got it in the mail as soon as I could, and well, I don't think more than an hour or 2 went by, and they announced my name over the loudspeaker that I was supposed to report the officer of the deck. Well, I didn't even know who the officer of the deck was or where he was, but I finally found him, and he took me into a cabin and asked me if I was Don Smith. I said yes. And he said, "Did you know that there's a war on?" And I said, "Well, yes, yes, sir." And he said, "Well, do you know anything about security?" And I said, "Well, not really." And he said, "Is this your letter?" And he took out this almost shredded piece of paper where he had cut out all the parts about coming aboard ship and how many ships I saw and on and on. And there was hardly anything left of this letter, just a couple of shreds. He says, "Was this your letter?" And I said, "Yes, sir." He says, "You can't do that." He says, "There's a war on. You can't go sending mail, information in the mail. I don't care where you're sending it. You could get court-martialed for doing something like that." Well, of course, that scared me half to death, and I never did ever forget that, and I was very, very careful what I wrote after that, because all our letters were censored before they left the ship. Now, this particular officer name was Curtis. At the time, I didn't know it, but he was going to be our communications officer. And I didn't know that at the time, but I learned it quite soon after that. However, he turned out to be a great guy, and I'll tell more about him later in this tape. We were then assigned to bunks. Instead of using our hammocks, we were finally going to sleep in a bunk. And we had a locker, and so they sent us down to the communications division, where the radioman and the signalman slept, and there were 3 bunks stacked, and they all folded up in the daytime so that they didn't take much room, and they had a mattress on them. And it so happened that the fellow that was above me, I was in the second bunk, and the guy above me, his name was Jim Wessels. And he and I became great friends and are to this day, and I'll tell you more about that at a later date also. The fellow down below me was a fellow by the name of Seneschal. He was from Chicago, and he had come aboard with me from the radio school. I'll tell you more about him at a later time also. He was quite interesting. Now I'm going to take a break right here and tell you about some of the cities and ports and places that we went to on the Augusta. I was aboard ship for about 2 years, and I'll just give you an idea of some of the places that we went. From Norfolk, we went to New York, to Brooklyn, Navy Yards. We also went out on many training exercises. We went to Portland, Maine, went to Halifax, went to Argentia and Placentia in Newfoundland. We went to Akureyri and Reykjavik in Iceland. We went into the Arctic Circle off the coast of Norway. We went to the Scapa Flow, which was in the Orkneys and Shetland Islands, north of Great Britain. Went to Belfast, Ireland, Plymouth, England. We were the flagship at D-Day at Normandy, which I'll go into more detail later. We were also the flagship at southern France, around Toulon and Marseille. We went to Oran in North Africa, to Palermo in Sicily, Naples in Italy. Of course, we'd gone through the Suez Canal. We were in the Mediterranean, which was a beautiful ocean, I thought. Previously, we'd been to Greenwich, Scotland, and then we took a train to Edinburgh. We crossed the Atlantic 2 or 3 times on convoys, and then preparing for the invasion of France. We docked in Philadelphia when we came back from the invasion of Europe. I think I should make a correction at this time. I don't think we really went through the Suez Canal. We went through the Straits of Gibraltar, which was just below Portugal and Spain. As I mentioned before, I went aboard ship in Norfolk, and from there the ship went to Brooklyn, and we got liberty in Brooklyn and got into New York City. And that, of course, was quite an experience because things were pretty well blacked out at the time, but there was a lot to do there. And we happened to be there right around Christmas time, and I was able to get a leave and go home for, I believe it was a week or 10 days. While we were there, as I said, it was around Christmas time, and I used to, on a few of the liberties I had, went into New York City and stayed at the Soldiers and Sailors Club overnight. And a lady there gave me and another fella passes to go to Radio City Music Hall for the Christmas pageant. And we did so and really enjoyed it. It was really something to see. And of course they had the Rockettes, and it was quite a show. In fact, one little part about it that was funny is that there were so many hundreds of people lined up all the way around the building waiting to get in for the next show. And of course we had to go way to the end of the line. It was about 2 blocks long. And an usher was coming down, checking the people and that, and he said, anybody here have any passes? Well, we had passes, and he said, come with me. So he took us 2 blocks in front of all these people, and we got in and got up to the balcony way ahead of everybody else. In fact, a lot of those people didn't get in for that show because the place was packed. But it was really worthwhile. And we also went to the Stage Door Canteen, which was across the street from Radio City Music Hall and the Rockefeller Center, and it was really kind of a fun place to go. Always had a little lunch and little soap and combs and toothbrushes and all kinds of stuff that they gave you. From Brooklyn, then, we went on to Newfoundland, to a harbor there, and the nearest town was Placentia, and we went into Placentia, walked in, and that was, of course, a long walk. We had a little fun doing that. But I had a problem with the chief radioman. He, of course, was an old Navy man and wasn't happy with getting these young kids that came in and got their rating right out of school, and it had taken him many, many years to get the same rating. And he and I didn't get along too good. I guess I was a little arrogant, and he didn't like me right off the bat, so he said, I'll take care of you, Smith. He said, I'll give you general quarters station up in the foretop. Well, that was something. I'd have to show you a picture of the ship first so that you could see where the foretop was. This is an old ship, and some of them were, the place was called a crow's nest. It was way up the top, sort of a round room, and it had, you came up several flights of ladders straight up, like you would walk up a ladder to go up on a roof. And then there was a door that opened up in the floor, and you had to open that up. They called it a hatch. And then you crawled up into the room, and that's where the seamen would usually be to watch for submarines and so forth. There was always someone stationed up there. And it was not a very good place for a radioman to go. But that's what he assigned me to, and I had that general quarters station for at least a year. There was radio equipment up there, so you could receive and transmit from that station. It so happened that it turned out to be a really good spot to some extent. The officer that I had mentioned earlier, Lieutenant Curtis, was also stationed in the foretop at times when we would practice shooting at drones and other types of targets. That was the only time he was really up there. But we did a lot of practicing out of Newfoundland there, and out in the Atlantic, of course. Our planes, we had planes aboard that we could shoot off with catapults and pick them up later with a hoist. And they would tow large canvas drones and so forth, and then our fellows on the machine guns would shoot at them, at the drones. And then at times we would have, they would drop things in the water. The plane would drop things in the water so that we'd have practice shooting the bigger guns at the targets. And my job turned out to be working with Lieutenant Curtis and working with these planes. He would get the orders from captain or whoever, the gunnery officer, and then he would tell me what to say, and then I would talk to the pilots and the planes. And when we were shooting the bigger guns, sometimes they were many miles away, and he would, the pilot would give us the location that we would use, and of course we had maps that we were using to do this with, and he'd give me the location, and I would give it to the Lieutenant Curtis, and he would give it to the gunnery officer, and the gunnery officer would have his men line up the artillery in that direction according to the information that we'd received from the pilot. And then when they were ready to fire, he would tell Lieutenant Curtis, and he'd tell me, and I would tell the pilot, and then we'd shoot, and I'd tell him when we shot, because he usually couldn't hear that, and then he would know how many minutes it would be before the shell would drop at the target, and then when he'd see the shell drop, he'd tell me how far off we were, right, left, or up or down. I'd tell Lieutenant Curtis, he'd tell the gunnery officer, and they would change the guns accordingly. So it was kind of exciting, it was fun, and it turned out, as I said, to be a very good spot on the ship. And even though Lieutenant Curtis wasn't with me most of the time, I got a lot of training from him. And all our trips over and back and forth across the ocean, we would all have to go to general quarters an hour before daylight, and you would stay up there or stay at your general quarters station until daylight, and then they would secure. And the idea, of course, would be that's when you would expect the submarines to discover you. So you would have your men, plus the radar and sonar, checking to see if they could see any submarines. it was an exciting place to be, and the only problem was that, the real problem was that the ship would rock and roll and dive into the waves, and anybody that got seasick very often would really be sick up there, and that was really why the chief sent me up there. However, for whatever reason, I didn't get sick. Most fellas on the ship got sick at some time or another. And there was times when I would go up into the foretop, and we had rough seas, and 3 or 4 seamen would be up there, and they had been sick. And turn the tape over.